Chris Hensley is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer member of FINRA SIPC, investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and Houston First Financial Group are not affiliated.
The Houston Midtown chapter of the Society for Financial Awareness presents Money Matters with your host, Christopher Hensley.
Good morning, everybody. You're listening to Money Matters on KPFT Houston. I'm Chris Hensley. The time is now 11 a.m. Got a great show lined up for you today. According to noted scientist and best-selling author Dean Radin, magic is a natural aspect of reality, and each of us can tap into this power with diligent practice. But wait, aren't things like ESP and telepathy just wishful thinking and flights of the imagination? Not according to the author, who has worked on the U.S. government's top-secret psychic espionage program known as Stargate. Radin has spent the last 40 years conducting controlled experiments that demonstrate that thoughts are things, that we can sense others' emotions and intentions from a distance, that intuition is more powerful than we thought, and that we can tap into the power of intention. So our guest today is Dr. Dean Radin. He is the author of the new book, Real Magic. Extremely excited to talk with Dean today, so please stay tuned. Keep listening. He will be joining us very, very shortly. If you are a long-time listener of the show, you know that we always use just the first few minutes of the show to tell you a little bit about what's going on here in the Houston and the Gulf Coast region when it comes to financial literacy. So we do have two talks coming up soon. On the 26th of May, we will be talking at the Youngman Library on Teacher Retirement System, or TRS. This is free and open to the public, but primarily it involves UT Healthcare, University of Houston, Houston Community College employees who are participating in the TRS system. Also, coming up on June 20th, we have a Social Security speaker who is one of the most sought speakers in the country when it comes to Social Security. We have been lucky enough to get her to come down and speak to us on June 20th. So we're still in the process of finding a venue for that, but this will be on a Wednesday, and it will be from 12 to 1. We'll talk about Social Security and Medicare as well. So please stay tuned. Keep listening for more details on that. We did make our way through Financial Literacy Month, or here in Houston, it's known as Houston Money Week. And so it's May. We are now in May. Houston Money Week is almost a done deal. There are some events that have actually bled over into May. And so I do encourage people to go out to the website, HoustonMoneyWeek.org, to find out what free financial literacy classes are available for you. And with that, let's go ahead and get Dean on the line. Dean, are you there?
I'm here.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining the show this morning.
It's my pleasure.
Well, so I kind of start the show the same way. So what I'll do is I'll share your bio for listeners so that they can get to know you just a little bit better. And Dr. Dean Radin is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, or IONS, an associated distinguished professor of integral and transpersonal psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. His original career track as a concert violinist shifted into science after earning a BSEE in electrical engineering, magna cum laude with honors in physics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and then an MS in electrical engineering and a PhD in psychology from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Whew, okay, that's a mouthful. Well, Dean, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit outside of the bio for listeners, share something about yourself for listeners to get to know you just a little bit better?
Well, I have a pretty traditional educational background, and I early on worked at Bell Laboratories. I was at Princeton University, a few other traditional places, but my career for the past 35, 40 years has been anything but traditional. I use the tools and techniques of science, which is what I was trained in, to study unusual experiences, psychic experiences, mystical experiences, and all of them are related in one way or another to the nature of consciousness. So consciousness research is what I primarily focus on, and there's much to be learned about the nature of consciousness.
Absolutely. I'm super excited to talk to you about this. And before we started the show, I kind of a full disclosure with the audience here. At the end of Houston Money Week or April Financial Literacy Month, I got on Audible, and I had kind of a finance fatigue there. So, okay, what am I going to read that's going to put me away from the finance for a little bit? And in April, Art Bell passed away, who was the host for Coast to Coast. And so let me check out this book, Real Magic. I got finished listening to it, and I want to say that this is a fantastic book, and we're kind of do a deep dive into it here. Why did you write this book?
Well, that's a very good question. A related question is that this is a book on esoteric magic, meaning it's not Harry Potter and it's not Harry Houdini. It's the real stuff. Why would a book on this topic be endorsed by 2 Nobel laureate scientists and a former program director at the National Science Foundation and many other very prominent scientists? And the answer is that it turns out that when you look deeply at the history of magic, you find that magic turned into what we currently think of as science. That if you go back far enough in history, even only 500 years, we hardly understood anything collectively. And eventually we saw that there are certain regularities in the world, and that turned into what they called natural magic, certain lawful regularities and phenomena like magnetism. And it eventually became terms like alchemy, which turned into chemistry, and astrology, which turned into astronomy, and so on. So the history of science is very closely related to the history of magic. But when you look at it a little bit more closely, a scientist today usually would say, well, magic is just superstitious thinking. It's wishing for things and wanting them to come true. If you go back into the medieval times when people were working with the beginnings of chemistry and the beginnings of the pharmaceutical business, and all of those beginnings, all still considered to be magic, all of them had a component which has been left out of science. And that component was the consciousness of the practitioner, which turned out to be an extremely important piece. So I became curious, well, why was that left out? Because anybody doing alchemy would understand that the intentions and attention of the practitioner was as important as the materials themselves. The same for people doing herbalism, which turned into the pharmaceutical business, or astronomy even, and astrology. So because I've been studying psychic phenomena for a long time, mostly in the laboratory, it occurred to me that maybe what we think of as magic today actually is a component of future science. In other words, science has not yet caught up to these kinds of phenomena associated with consciousness, as chemistry kind of left that aside and the pharmaceutical business left consciousness aside. I think given where we are right now in science, if you look at the leading edge in science, in many different disciplines, what you find is an inkling that we are indeed moving toward a future science where it will look a lot more like this ancient form of esoteric magic than we currently can appreciate.
I love the examples that you give of things that people might not have thought about, but astrology leading to astronomy, alchemy leading to chemistry. One of the things that you write in the book, you say magic didn't disappear with the rise of scientific worldview. Can you give us some examples of how that has progressed? Well,
we are saturated with magic all the time. The act of prayer is a form of focused intention. Well, that is very clearly part of the esoteric traditions. Most religions require that some form of magic, and I'm talking about esoteric-type magic, that it requires that it exists. For example, the Catholic ceremony of the Eucharist is very explicitly a magical ceremony. Within most religions, there are only certain people who are ordained to be able to do the magic, but you can see that, in a sense, as a form of social control, because the magic itself is just a force of nature. It's like lightning. How you use it and under what context you use it is something that humans decide. So within religion, magic is an acceptable thing. But if you do it outside of that religion, that particular religion, then it's considered to be demonic or something like that. So I think what we're dealing with here is, as I said, something like a force of nature. It simply is something associated with consciousness. Our consciousness is probably more deeply embedded into reality than we ordinarily think. And so that's the way that I think about it.
One of the things that and we're going to kind of jump around a little bit here, but one of the things that you talk about in the book that I've been interested in for some time is the phenomenon of remote viewing. Can you talk to us about this?
Okay, so remote viewing is a modern euphemism for clairvoyance. It means the ability to perceive unconstrained by the usual limitations of space and time. So clairvoyance usually thought of as perception across space, but it's also perception through time, and we sometimes call that precognition. So in the magical tradition, there's a practice known as divination, which the image that comes to mind are things like mirror gazing and looking in a crystal ball or working with tarot cards, that sort of thing. So it's a very popular practice, but all of it was associated with the idea of looking through space and time. In the modern world, we have experimental methods to see whether that's a real thing, is it a real skill or not. The answer is yes, and I talk about that in the book a little bit. But more important than is it a real thing is the question of is it pragmatically useful? And there the answer also is yes. And in fact, it was used for about 20 years within the military and intelligence world for psychic spying. Because as you can imagine, if you can perceive through space and time, that would be quite useful for espionage, and that's indeed what it was used for.
And that is non-disputable. I mean, people can look and go back and see that there was budget dollars allocated towards this concept of remote viewing. Now, whether it's a thing or not, you have actually done some scientific experiments. Can you tell us some of the data behind that shows, or talk to us about some of the scientific data?
Do you mean specifically for remote viewing or for other phenomena?
Sure, either or.
Okay, so it's a little easier to describe how a telepathy experiment would work.
Okay, perfect.
So telepathy is the idea that one mind can perceive something about what's going on in another mind. Typically, the word telepathy itself means feeling at a distance, and that's usually the way that this goes. It's not that you get somebody's thoughts; you get more about a feeling that they have or something about the context that they're in. So in the laboratory, what you do is you take a pair of people, you assign one to be a sender of information and one to receive the information. Beforehand, you prepare a series of targets, usually in groups of 4. These would be like 4 photographs. The photographs would be as different from each other as you can manage, different contexts, different pictures, different colors, and so on. And then you create a large pool of such groups of 4 pictures. So you might have, say, 100 groups of 4 pictures in your pool, all different pictures. So now when the experiment comes around, you isolate the 2 people so there's no ordinary way that they can communicate. You give the sender, you randomly pick one of the pools of 4 targets, and then you randomly pick one of the 4, and you give that target to the sender, who mentally tries to convey that information to the receiver. So the receiver knows the name of the game. They know that they're going to try to get a mental impression. They know that they're trying to get it from their friend, the sender. but they have no idea what it is. In fact, the sender didn't know beforehand either. Neither of them can know beforehand what the random picture was. So the sending period goes on for 20 minutes or so. At the end of that, the receiver is taken out of their imaginative state, and they're shown 4 pictures, one of which was the one the sender was sending, and 3 decoys. And so by chance, you would expect them to select the correct picture 1 in 4 times, because if they have no other form of information, they can't guess better than 1 in 4. So what I just described, that kind of protocol has been conducted over 4,000 times and published in about over 100 publications by about 20 laboratories around the world for 4 decades. So there's a lot of data. The result of any given experiment, which typically takes about 90 minutes to actually do correctly, is a single data point. They either got the correct picture or they didn't. And again, by chance, you'd expect 25%. What we see after the 4,000 plus sessions is 32%. Well, 32% doesn't sound like that much more than 25%, but because there's so much data, you can create a statistical test to see what's the odds against chance of getting 32% instead of 25. And the answer, to use a technical term, is a gazillion to 1.
Wow.
It's simply not it's not a chance outcome. And then you can start partitioning the data to look for pairs of people who might be emotionally bonded or come from the same family, or who report that they've had these kinds of telepathic connections, and then you don't get 32%, you get more like 50, sometimes 60%. So the data is suggestive that when there's a reason, an emotional connection between the people, these kinds of experiences are much more common. And because you're using random pictures, it can't be attributed simply to common memories or common experiences, because both people in the experiment have no idea beforehand what the target is going to be in the experiment. So that's considered a conscious form of psychic phenomena, because the receiver has to consciously know how to make a guess. But there are many unconscious forms of the same sort of experiment. One example is, rather than having a sender and receiver try to send visual information, you put on EEGs. You're looking at their brain activity. And then you shine a light periodically to the sender, and you look to see whether the receiver's brain jumps a little bit at the same time as the sender gets a light flash. So that's called an EEG correlation experiment, and that's been done many times as well. And overall, that shows a similar response. You do a stimulus to one person, and the other person flinches a little bit.
I think it's very important that you're able to ask these questions, and that you're able to we're getting data that's coming back over that random chance. I know a lot of people, if they're in an academic setting or even just publicly, won't come out and say, I don't think that this is a real thing. But if you personally ask them, have you experienced something that is unexplainable, whether you or your family member, a lot of times you're going to hear stories. I know one of the examples you give is just distant staring. If have you ever felt somebody looking at you from outside the doorway? That kind of thing. Can you tell us a little bit about distant staring?
Yeah, distant staring is typically from a man staring at a woman, but not always. It could be anyone staring intently at somebody else. The experience itself is that you get an uncomfortable, vague sense that something's not quite right, and you look up or you look around to the back and you see someone is staring at you. So it makes a kind of an evolutionary sense that we would have this ability to detect staring, because in the wild, if a wild animal is staring at you, or a predator, then you better know that, otherwise you're not going to live for very long. So it's true that there's a taboo, especially in the academic world, that you don't talk about these things. So we did a survey to ask people not what they believed in, but what did they experience. We had a list of 25 different kinds of experiences, of which the feeling of being stared at was one kind. And we asked the general population in a large survey, and then we also asked a subset of scientists and engineers, because it's usually assumed that scientists and engineers don't have these things. That's why it doesn't show up in the mainstream science press. But we didn't know, so we did the survey. So among the general population, 94% of people said that they had experienced at least one of the 25 different kinds of psychic experiences. And we figured, well, that's about right. We know that these are very commonly reported. Then we asked the scientists and engineers, and the response here was 93%. 93% reported at least one of these psychic phenomena. And so the next question is, well, then why don't you talk about it? Well, it's a complicated story, which as you know, I talk about it in the book quite a bit. The reason why the esoteric literature is called esoteric is because the word means suppressed. It's hidden, it's suppressed. And it's suppressed both by religion as suppressed equally by science. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is to try to get rid of the taboo that simply prevents us from talking about things that are very commonly experienced.
Well, I love the ability to ask the question. I'm just going to, you said 93% of people, including scientists and engineers, say they've had some kind of psychic related phenomenon happen over their lifetime. I know myself, my grandfather grew up on a ranch in Texas as a boy, and one of the ways that they found water was using a dowsing rod. That was just, and there was nothing weird about it. That was just one of the things that they did. And you know, the distant staring that you mentioned, I think that's a kind of a universal. A lot of people will say, yeah, you know, I can understand that. Even precognitive dreams, having a dream that at some point in the future you either have that deja vu or things that happen, those are a lot more common than people think. You also mentioned the taboo there between whether it's religion or science. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the biggest roadblocks to academically studying these phenomenons?
It's acceptable in academia to talk about people's belief and in these kinds of phenomena because we know that it's very common. It's not acceptable to talk about these phenomena as though they're real. And the reason is that in the academic world, and this is now true everywhere in the world, it used to be just Western academia, but Western academia is taught everywhere now. What it means is that it's a scientific worldview that looks at reality through a certain lens. A lens is called materialism. It's simply a way of understanding how reality is put together. Well, this method, materialism, is extremely successful. It has created all of the wonderful technologies that we have and has doubled or tripled our lifetime and so on. So we know that it's correct. The thing is, does it also create blinders? And it does create blinders. In fact, it makes it very difficult for us to attend to certain kinds of effects. And one of those effects is, in fact, psychic phenomena, that the effects actually occur. People report these experiences. Practically everybody, including skeptics of these phenomena, if they're asked the question in the right way, they will say, yeah, I've experienced that. I'm talking about things as simple as a gut feeling, a hunch about something where you know something without knowing how you know it. Another example is what I call presentiment, which we can study in the laboratory. In presentiment, you're driving along the road, you're coming up to an intersection, you have a green light, the cross street has a red light, but as you approach the green light, you start feeling something's wrong. So you slow down, and the closer you get to the green light, the slower you go, which is annoying the people behind you. And then when you get to the green light, somebody blasts through the red light. 50 miles an hour would have hit you broadside if you had not slowed down. So that experience, when I've described that for many different audiences, lots of people have had at least one experience like that, where this momentary sense that something was off saved their life. So one would think that because it's so common that this would be studied. I mean, we have thousands of universities and tens of thousands of people who are qualified to study these things. Almost no one is studying it. Worldwide, there's about 150 scientists who are studying this, as compared to millions upon millions of people who could study it and actually want to study it, but they're not allowed to. The social construct says, no, you're not going to look at that.
So I like the distinction that you made that it's okay, the belief of these things, but when you actually start putting the material, these are real phenomenons that are happening, let's study that, then that's the taboo part of it there.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about what's currently going on with modern fiction and movies. I mean, you see magic there. There's been a rise with psychedelic research as well. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of where magic is heading?
Well, because magic never went away and is just as popular now as it was probably 10,000 years ago, it has to come out somewhere. People experience it. People are interested in it. So since it's not allowed to come out in the academic world, it comes out in entertainment. So if you look at the most successful book series and movie series, all of them have to do with what might be called paranormal themes. Unfortunately, in many cases, they end up in the horror genre, which is unfortunate, I think. But the fact that it shows up in practically every comic book-inspired movie and lots of other movies and television programs and fiction says that there's some element within us that is deeply attracted to these ideas. And some of it certainly is going to be related to fantasy, and some is related to wishful thinking. But because it's so persistent and because it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, if you step back from it and you can ask, I think realistically, well, why is this so attractive? I mean, this is not something that you're taught in school. This is something that people are pulled toward. And my answer is that they're pulled toward it because some elements of the way it's portrayed in fiction actually do occur in people's lives. Well, of course, we always have to keep in mind that fiction is a massive embellishment of reality, but that it occurs at all is already very interesting.
Well, Dean, we're bumping close to the end of the show here. What have I forgot to ask you that you want to tell our listeners about your book?
Well, of course, one thing is, where do you get it?
That's a good one, yes.
Yeah. You can get it at any online or retail bookstore. It's in Kindle form or ebook form and paperback and audiobook.
And if you are driving right now, on the podcast version of the show, we'll have links to the book as well on the podcast notes.
Great. And so the audiobook, I had the opportunity to select the reader, which was nice. Some of my friends wanted me to read it, and I didn't want to read it because I'm not a professional in that domain. So the person I chose is the same voice artist as the one who reads most of the Dan Brown books.
Oh, wow.
So he has a nice, calming, avuncular kind of voice. And it's the kind of voice artist that could read the phone book and you'd fall in love with it. So I was very happy that I had the opportunity to choose somebody who is a really good reader. And since you've listened to the audiobook, you know that it's actually pleasant to listen to.
Absolutely. I couldn't put it down. I went from the beginning to the end. So
the other thing is that my other books, I've written 3 other books. They're a little bit more in the academic vein, and they're also much longer. And so when I wrote this book, the editor I worked with said, only write 220 pages. Well, it's not that easy to talk about complex topics in 220 pages because you have to provide a lot of context and history and so on. But that was the challenge. So I took up the challenge, and I think that the book is doing quite well. Within Amazon's category of religion and spirituality, the audiobook is actually on the top 100 list. It's around 40 or something like that. So people are resonating with it, and if it continues to do well, I'll write a longer book, which actually goes into some of these topics in much more detail. What people mostly seem to be interested in is, how do you do it?
Right.
What do you do? Well, there's a lot that can be said about that.
Well, and we didn't even, we only have a half hour here on the show, but we didn't even get into the history, and that was a big part of the book, was the history, the very, very interesting stuff. Dean, thank you so much for being on the show today. Thank you for continuing to ask those questions that people don't want us to ask.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Money Matters Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, visit us on the web at www.moneymatterspodcast.com. Drop us a line on SpeakPipe on the right-hand corner. It will receive any voicemails, questions, thoughts, concerns that you have about the show. In addition to this, we recently launched a Patreon campaign. Click on the Donate Now tab to hit the tip jar and find out what Patreon's campaign is all about.